I always believed that love meant sacrifice. For 28 years, I had lived by this philosophy, pouring every ounce of my energy, time, and resources into being the daughter my family needed me to be. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I was the eldest of 3 children in what everyone in our small Connecticut town considered the perfect American family. My father, Robert, owned a successful accounting firm, and my mother, Linda, was the quintessential homemaker who volunteered at every charity event and knew everyone's business within a 50-mile radius. From as early as I could remember, I was the responsible one. When my younger brother Jake struggled with his math homework, I was the one who stayed up until midnight, helping him understand algebra. When my sister Emma wanted to join the expensive dance academy across town, I was the one who gave up my own piano lessons so the family budget could accommodate her dreams. When my parents fought about money, I was the one who quietly took on babysitting jobs to help pay for groceries, never mentioning to anyone that the successful family business was hemorrhaging money due to my father's gambling addiction. By the time I graduated high school, I had already accepted a full scholarship to the state university, not because it was my dream school, but because it was close enough to home that I could continue helping my family while pursuing my education. I majored in business administration, a practical choice that would ensure I could always provide for others. My own dreams of studying literature or perhaps traveling to see the world beyond our small town were luxuries I couldn't afford when my family needed me. The pattern continued through college and into my early career. I landed a good job at a marketing firm in Hartford, and suddenly I became the family's financial safety net. And when Jake's car broke down, I bought him a new one. When Emma needed money for her wedding, I emptied my savings account without hesitation. When my parents faced foreclosure on their house due to mounting debts, I took out a second mortgage on my own modest condo to help them keep their home. Each time, they promised it would be the last time. Each time, I believed them. My mother would cry and tell me how grateful she was to have such a wonderful daughter. My father would shake my hand solemnly and promise to pay me back as soon as business picked up. Jake would hug me and swear he'd make it up to me someday. Emma would gush about how I was the best sister in the world and how lucky she was to have me. But somehow, there was always another crisis, another emergency that only I could solve. Another situation where my family's happiness depended on my willingness to sacrifice my own needs for theirs. I began to feel like I was drowning, working overtime constantly just to keep everyone else afloat. My coworkers often asked why I never took vacations, or why I always looked so tired. I would just smile and tell them I was fine, because admitting the truth felt like betraying my family. The breaking point came on what should have been one of the happiest days of my life. After years of working 60-hour weeks and living paycheck to paycheck despite my good salary, I had finally managed to save enough money for a down payment on my dream house. It was a small Victorian cottage about 20 minutes from my current apartment, with a garden where I could grow vegetables, and a little study where I could finally start writing the novel I had been planning for years. I had been secretly house hunting for months, not wanting to tell my family until everything was finalized, because I knew they would find reasons why I shouldn't spend the money on myself. The day I was supposed to sign the papers, I was practically vibrating with excitement. For the first time in my adult life, I was doing something purely for my own happiness. That morning, my phone rang at 6 a.m. It was my mother, sobbing hysterically. Through her tears, she managed to tell me that Emma's husband had left her, taking all their savings and leaving her with massive credit card debts. Emma was 3 months pregnant and had no money for rent, no money for groceries, and nowhere to go. My mother begged me to help, painting a picture of my sister living on the streets with an unborn child. I felt the familiar weight settle on my chest, that crushing sense of responsibility that had defined my entire adult life. Without really thinking about it, I heard myself telling my mother that everything would be okay, that I would take care of it. I hung up the phone and stared at the stack of loan documents on my kitchen table, the keys to my future sitting right next to them. 2 hours later, I was at the bank, canceling my mortgage application and withdrawing the money I had saved for my house. The bank officer looked confused, asking if I was sure I wanted to liquidate my down payment savings. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. By noon, I had transferred $15,000 to Emma's account, enough to cover her debts and several months of rent on a decent apartment. I called my real estate agent to tell her I was withdrawing my offer on the house. She was shocked, having seen how excited I was about the property. When she asked what had happened, I gave her some vague excuse about a family emergency. The disappointment in her voice when she told me that someone else would probably snatch up the house within days was nothing compared to the hollow ache in my chest. That evening, my family gathered at my parents' house for what my mother called a celebration dinner to welcome Emma back home. I sat at the familiar dining room table, surrounded by the people I loved most in the world, and felt more alone than I ever had in my life. Everyone was talking about Emma's fresh start, about how lucky she was to have such a supportive family, about how everything would work out for the best. Nobody asked how I was feeling about giving up my house. Nobody seemed to notice that I barely touched my food, or that I kept staring out the window with tears in my eyes. When Emma hugged me and thanked me for saving her life, I managed to smile and tell her that's what family was for. But inside, I was screaming. The final straw came 2 weeks later. I was scrolling through Facebook during my lunch break when I saw a post from Emma. She was at an expensive spa resort about 2 hours away, grinning widely in a photo with the caption, "Much-needed girls' weekend. Thanks to my amazing sister for making this possible." The post was tagged with the location of a resort that I knew charged at least $300 per night. I stared at the photo for a long time, my hands shaking with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Here was my sister, using the money I had given her for survival to take a luxury vacation, while I was eating a peanut butter sandwich for lunch, because I couldn't afford anything else until my next paycheck. The money I had saved for years, the dream I had sacrificed, had become her weekend getaway. That night, I did something I had never done before. I called Emma and asked her directly about the spa trip. Her response was casual, almost dismissive. She told me she had been through a traumatic time and deserved to treat herself. When I gently pointed out that the money was supposed to be for necessities, she became defensive, accusing me of being controlling and unsympathetic to her situation. The conversation escalated quickly. Emma told me that I had always been jealous of her because she was prettier and more fun, that I used money to manipulate people because I had no other way to make them care about me. She said that maybe if I had tried harder to be a better sister over the years, her husband wouldn't have left her, implying that somehow his abandonment was connected to my failure to be supportive enough. Each word hit me like a physical blow. This was the person I had sacrificed everything for, the sister whose happiness I had prioritized over my own for years. And, in her mind, I was the villain in her story, the controlling older sister who held money over everyone's head instead of the devoted family member who had given up her own dreams to ensure everyone else could pursue theirs. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my empty apartment and really looked at my life for the first time. I was 28 years old, living in a dingy one-bedroom apartment because every penny I earned went to my family. I had no savings, no emergency fund, no prospects for homeownership in the foreseeable future. I worked constantly but had nothing to show for it, except the gratitude of people who seemed to view my sacrifices as their entitlement. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day doing something I had never done before. I made a list of every dollar I had given to my family over the past 10 years. The number was staggering, including the direct gifts, the loans that were never repaid, the purchases I had made on their behalf, and the opportunities I had foregone to help them. I calculated that I had sacrificed nearly $200,000 of my own financial security for their benefit. As I stared at the numbers on the page, I realized that I wasn't actually helping my family by constantly rescuing them from their problems. I was enabling them to make poor decisions, because they knew I would always be there to clean up the mess. My generosity hadn't made them more responsible or grateful, it had made them more entitled and less capable of managing their own lives. That realization was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. If I stopped being the family's safety net, what would happen to them? More importantly, what would happen to my relationship with them? Would they still love me if I wasn't constantly proving my worth through financial sacrifice? The fear of losing my family's love had controlled every major decision I had made for my entire adult life. But sitting in my sparse apartment, surrounded by the evidence of my own self-neglect, I realized that I had already lost something even more important than their love. I had lost myself. Making the decision to change my relationship with my family was the hardest thing I had ever done. It went against every instinct I had developed over nearly 3 decades of people-pleasing. But I knew that if I continued down the same path, I would wake up at 55, with nothing to show for my life except a family who took my sacrifices for granted. The next time my mother called asking for money, this time to help pay for Jake's court fees after a DUI arrest, I said no. The word felt foreign in my mouth, like speaking a language I had never learned. My mother was shocked into silence for several seconds, before launching into a familiar speech about family loyalty, and how disappointed she was in my selfishness. I listened to her words, hearing the manipulation techniques that had worked on me for so many years, and felt something shift inside me. Instead of the usual guilt and panic that drove me to immediately cave to her demands, I felt a strange sense of calm. I told her that I loved Jake, and hoped he would learn from this experience, but that bailing him out of every consequence would not help him grow into a responsible adult. The conversation did not go well. My mother accused me of abandoning my family in their time of need. She brought up every sacrifice she had made for me as a child, every time she had put my needs before her own. She reminded me of all the ways the family had supported me over the years, conveniently forgetting that most of that support had been emotional rather than financial, and that I had been the primary financial contributor to the family for nearly a decade. When guilt didn't work, she tried anger, telling me that I was being cruel and heartless. When anger didn't work, she tried bargaining, promising that this would be the absolute last time she would ever ask me for money. When I remained firm in my decision, she hung up on me. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in my adult life, I had refused a family request for money, and the sky hadn't fallen. The world hadn't ended. I felt guilty and scared, but underneath those familiar emotions was something new, an unexpected relief. Over the following weeks, I began to establish boundaries that I should have set years earlier. I stopped answering my phone every time a family member called, allowing some calls to go to voicemail so I could evaluate whether the conversation would be productive before engaging. I stopped offering solutions to every problem they shared with me, learning to say, "That sounds really difficult," instead of, "Let me fix that for you." The hardest part was watching my family struggle with problems that I could easily solve if I chose to intervene. Jake ended up spending a weekend in jail before my parents could scrape together the money for his bail. Emma had to move in with my parents temporarily and take a job waitressing to support herself during her pregnancy. My father had to start attending Gamblers Anonymous when his debt became impossible to hide without my financial cushion to fall back on. Each of these situations felt like a test of my resolve. Every instinct I had developed over a lifetime told me to swoop in and rescue them. But I forced myself to remember that their problems were not my responsibility to solve, and that solving them had never actually helped anyone learn or grow. My family's reaction to my new boundaries was swift and predictable. I was labeled selfish, ungrateful, and cold-hearted. Family gatherings became uncomfortable affairs, where I was either ignored or subjected to passive-aggressive comments about my lack of family loyalty. Emma stopped speaking to me entirely after I refused to co-sign a lease for a more expensive apartment she couldn't afford on her waitressing salary. The hardest moment came when my mother called to tell me that I was no longer welcome at family gatherings if I was going to poison the atmosphere with my negativity. She said that my selfishness was tearing the family apart, and that it would be better for everyone if I stayed away until I was ready to act like a real daughter again. That phone call broke something inside me that I didn't even know was still intact. The family I had sacrificed everything for was casting me out because I had finally chosen to prioritize my own well-being. The people who had claimed to love me unconditionally were making it clear that their love was entirely conditional on my willingness to subsidize their lives. For several months, I felt completely adrift. Without the constant drama and financial crises of my family to manage, I had to figure out who I was as an individual rather than as a supporting character in everyone else's story. The silence from my family was painful, but it was also revealing. I began to notice how much mental and emotional energy I had been spending on their problems, energy that I could now redirect toward my own healing and growth. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in family dysfunction and codependency. Through our sessions, I began to understand the patterns that had shaped my family relationships and my own behavior. I learned that my constant rescuing had not been kindness but codependency, that my inability to say no had not been love but fear, and that my family's expectation of my sacrifice had not been normal but dysfunctional. The therapist helped me understand that healthy families support each other without requiring one member to carry the entire financial and emotional burden for everyone else. She showed me that real love involves respecting boundaries and encouraging independence, not demanding endless sacrifice and creating dependence. As I worked through my feelings of guilt and obligation, I also began to rebuild my financial life. Without the constant drain of family emergencies, I was able to save money for the first time in years. I opened a separate savings account that I didn't tell anyone about, slowly building back toward the down payment I had sacrificed for Emma. I also started investing in my own happiness in small ways. I bought myself books I wanted to read instead of practical items I needed. I took a weekend trip to New York City, something I had always wanted to do but had never felt I could justify spending money on. I enrolled in a creative writing class at the local community college, finally giving myself permission to pursue the dreams I had deferred for so long. Each small act of self-care felt revolutionary. For the first time in my adult life, I was living for myself rather than for others' approval. The guilt was still there, but it was gradually being replaced by something I had rarely experienced before: self-respect. 6 months after my mother had disinvited me from family gatherings, Jake called me. He had completed his community service requirement and had been sober for 3 months. His voice was different somehow, more mature and less entitled than I remembered. He told me that he had been thinking about our family dynamics and had realized how much pressure we had all put on me over the years. He didn't ask me for money or try to guilt me into resuming my old role. Instead, he apologized for taking my generosity for granted and told me that he respected my decision to establish boundaries. He said that being forced to deal with the consequences of his actions had been difficult but ultimately helpful, and that he was learning to take responsibility for his own life for the first time. That conversation gave me hope that change was possible, that my family might eventually learn to function in healthier ways. But I also knew that their growth was their responsibility, not mine, and that I couldn't sacrifice my own well-being to speed up their process. A year after I had started setting boundaries, Emma reached out. She was 7 months pregnant and had been promoted to assistant manager at the restaurant where she worked. She called to tell me that she had signed up for parenting classes and financial literacy workshops, and that she was determined to be able to support her child independently. Like Jake, she apologized for the way she had treated me, acknowledging that her reaction to my boundaries had been selfish and unfair. She said that being forced to become self-reliant had been scary at first, but that it had also given her a sense of pride and accomplishment she had never experienced when everything was handed to her. She asked if I would be willing to have lunch with her, not to discuss money or problems, but just to reconnect as sisters. I agreed, cautiously hopeful, but still protective of the peace I had worked so hard to build. Our lunch was awkward at first, both of us navigating this new dynamic where I wasn't automatically responsible for solving her problems. But as we talked, I saw glimpses of the sister I remembered from childhood, before our relationship had become defined by her needs and my attempts to meet them. She had grown up in ways that my constant rescuing had prevented, developing resilience and problem-solving skills she had never needed when I was always there to fix everything. The relationship with my parents took longer to repair. My father's gambling addiction had finally been addressed through therapy and support groups, but he struggled with shame about the way his problems had affected the family. My mother had to confront her role in enabling both his addiction and the family's dependence on me, which was particularly difficult for someone who had always seen herself as the family's emotional caretaker. It took nearly 2 years of family therapy sessions before we were able to have honest conversations about the dysfunction that had characterized our relationships for so many years. Even then, there were setbacks and difficult moments when old patterns tried to reassert themselves. But gradually, we learned to relate to each other as adults, rather than as rescuers and victims. My parents stopped treating me like an ATM and started asking about my life, my work, and my dreams. Jake and Emma began to see me as a person with my own needs and interests, rather than just a source of support for theirs. The family gatherings I eventually started attending again were smaller and quieter than they had been in the past, but they were also more genuine. Instead of performances designed to manipulate me into giving money or support, our interactions became real conversations about our lives, our struggles, and our growth. 3 years after I had first said no to a family request for money, I finally bought my house. It wasn't the Victorian cottage I had originally fallen in love with, but it was a beautiful split level with a garden and a home office where I could write. My family came to my housewarming party, and for the first time in my adult life, I was celebrating an achievement that was purely my own. As I stood in my backyard that evening, watching my family barbecue and laugh together without any crisis or drama to manage, I reflected on how much we had all changed. My parents had learned to solve their own problems, and had developed a more honest and sustainable relationship with money. Jake had become genuinely responsible, holding down a steady job and managing his own finances. Emma had grown into a confident single mother who was proud of her independence. Most importantly, I had learned that love doesn't require endless sacrifice, that boundaries are not selfish but necessary, and that taking care of myself doesn't make me a bad person. I had discovered that I could be a loving daughter and sister without being a doormat, and that my family could learn to love me for who I was rather than for what I could provide. The novel I had dreamed of writing for so many years was finally taking shape in my home office. Each evening after work, I would sit at my desk and pour my experiences onto paper, crafting a story about a woman who learns to value herself enough to demand better treatment from the people she loves. Writing that story was therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected. It helped me process the pain of those difficult years when I had felt so alone and unappreciated. But it also helped me celebrate the strength I had found within myself, the courage I had discovered to stand up for my own worth, even when it meant disappointing people I loved. As I wrote the final chapter of my novel, I realized that my story wasn't really about the money I had given up or the house I had almost lost. It was about something much more valuable, the discovery that I deserved to be loved and respected for who I was, not for what I could do for others. The woman who had once believed that love meant endless sacrifice had learned that real love requires mutual respect, healthy boundaries, and the courage to be authentic even when authenticity is difficult. I had lost years of my life to a dysfunctional family dynamic, but I had gained something infinitely more precious, an understanding of my own worth and the strength to protect it. Looking back, I could see that the pain of those difficult months when my family had rejected me for setting boundaries had been necessary for all of us to grow. Without that crisis, I never would have learned to value myself, and they never would have been forced to develop the independence and responsibility that had ultimately made them stronger and more capable. The family I had now was smaller and quieter than the one I had started with, but it was also healthier and more honest. We had learned to support each other without enabling destructive behavior, to show love without demanding sacrifice, and to respect each other's autonomy, even when it was inconvenient. My journey from doormat to self-advocate had been long and painful, but it had led me to a life I actually wanted to live, rather than one I felt obligated to endure. I had learned that it's not selfish to prioritize your own well-being, that you can't save people who don't want to be saved, and that the most loving thing you can sometimes do is to step back and let people face the consequences of their choices. As I submitted my finished novel to publishers, I knew that regardless of whether it was ever published, I had already achieved something more important than professional success. I had reclaimed my life, my identity, and my right to happiness. The woman who had once given away her house fund without a second thought now had a home, a career, and a family who loved her for who she was, rather than for what she could provide. The weight of expectations that had once crushed me had been lifted, replaced by the lighter but stronger foundation of self-respect and healthy boundaries. I had learned that true strength isn't about how much you can endure or sacrifice, but about how courageously you can protect your own well-being while still loving others. My story wasn't unique. There are countless people who struggle with similar family dynamics, who sacrifice their own dreams and happiness in the name of love and loyalty. But my journey had taught me that it's possible to break free from those patterns, to create healthier relationships, and to build a life that reflects your own values and desires rather than others' expectations. The most important lesson I learned was that you can't love others well if you don't love yourself enough to establish boundaries. Real love doesn't ask for endless sacrifice. It asks for honesty, respect, and the courage to be authentic even when that authenticity challenges comfortable but dysfunctional patterns. As I settled into my new life, I felt grateful for every difficult moment that had led me to this place of peace and self-respect. The family who had once seen me as their automatic solution to every problem now saw me as a full human being with my own needs, dreams, and limitations. And for the first time in my adult life, I could honestly say that I was proud of the woman I had become.